This is Bob Larson inside the refugee area at Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. This spring, more than 120,000 refugees were evacuated from Vietnam and Cambodia and transported to military camps in California, Florida, Arkansas, and here in Pennsylvania. For more than 4 months, the refugees who have not yet found American sponsors have been confined to the areas defined by these white tapes. During the hot days this summer, even the nearby mountains were off limits to the refugees. And if sponsors aren't found, they will be trying to keep warm this winter in these uninsulated barracks. Although they share a common heritage and the plight of being strangers in a new land, the Indo-Chinese refugees are individuals who have come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Most of them are Vietnamese, some are Cambodian. Among them are sophisticated city dwellers and farmers and fishermen. Many are well educated and some are not. There are highly trained professionals among them, and some are soldiers who have known only fighting. There are old people and young, and more than half are children.
How old are you?
5, thank you.
No, 5 years old.
5 years old. How are you?
5, thank you.
Good. What is your name?
My name is Salamfa.
You speak English very well.
Win Hun Tri is a teacher and an architect. She and Win Tran Quoc, a professor from the University of Delart, who have known each other for 7 years, were married in the refugee camp this summer. Tony To Han is a Montagnard. Educated in Europe and a former minister for minority affairs in Vietnam, he is trying to keep alive his cultural heritage. Win Tri Tu was a secretary in Vietnam, the wife of a Vietnamese Air Force officer. She managed to escape with her infant son and her brother and has been futilely trying to locate her husband. Most of the refugees, like Tien Dao, ex-soldier whose wife and baby failed to escape from Da Nang, have had tragedy in their lives.
I always have in mind, after I left Vietnam, that nowhere is my home, and anywhere can be my home.
The Indo-Chinese are political refugees like the Cubans and Hungarians who arrived in the 50s and 60s, but politics seem unimportant indeed when contrasted to their human needs. The Indo-Chinese refugees are not a great number of people for this country to absorb when compared to other ethnic groups that have been assimilated. But the Indo-Chinese arrived all at one time, and they had no established groups of fellow countrymen here to receive them. Ethnically, they are quite alone.
It's unique in one sense only that a substantial number of refugees, 130,000 of them, came to the United States within a very short period of time. 8 weeks, is that about it? And could not therefore be absorbed immediately into the mainstream of American life, but had to be taken to camps.
The Vietnamese, they came a long way and into an entirely different world. Now, we had the Hungarian refugees, I was in Austria at the time, who came about 190,000 who came within 3 months over the border. But they were in Europe, and many had relatives and friends and families there, and it was much easier for them. And I was very much surprised and how everything was organized. I came here 12 days after it started, and I walked through the camp and I didn't believe my eyes that it could have been done that quickly. And what impressed me most was there was no noise. Anybody was shouting, in spite of the fact that it's a military camp.
There was no way to protect people who were uprooted, as these people were, and removed thousands of miles from their homes without knowledge of where hope was coming from. There was no way of really protecting them completely from despair, but that there were ways of making them feel that there was hope. And essentially, I think what I said to the commanding people was that you should treat these people like you treat your neighbor or your friend or your brother. If his house was burned out or flooded, you reach out, you touch them, you hold them, you give them a sense that they still have a lot of worth and that there are people that still love them and want to help them.
More than 3/4 of the refugees evacuated from Indochina now have been sponsored and have left the camps. The people who remain at the camps spend their days waiting and watching others leave for new homes. They wait to be called for an interview, hoping for a sponsor, and they worry about life on the outside. Bolstering up sagging spirits and fighting the homesickness and boredom is a continuing effort for everyone in the refugee camps, and singing familiar old songs seems to help.
In an attempt to make use of their free time, Mr. Tuan and his oldest son volunteered to work at the locator service managed by the Red Cross. After attending classes, the children often plays on the grass with toys collected by the Salvation Army and the Red Cross. On weekends, Tuan's family is often invited to the visitor center to meet relatives and friends. Nearby community donate candies and pastries and sometimes even toys for the children. Although basic supplies are provided by the camp, the Tuan's family also sup at the PBS. Every evening at 4, most of the family attends Mass at the area chapel in the camp. On Assumption Day, one of Tuan's daughters received confirmation at a Mass celebrated by Cardinal Cook. It was the first time they saw a cardinal. Because he is a devout Catholic, Mr. Tuan chose the United States Catholic Conference for matching sponsors. The Tuan stands before a new life thanks to the generosity of the American people. They have been sponsored and now are settled in Terre Haute, Indiana, and look forward to a bright future.
Although academic classes now are in session for the refugee children remaining in the camps, summer activities for children were recreational and staffed in many cases by both American and refugee volunteers. Do I have a moral or a legal obligation, or both?
Moral. It's not a legal obligation. Sponsorship is purely moral.
How long does that relationship continue?
That continues until, and this is sort of where the moral obligation comes into it, until you honestly feel that the refugee family has become self-sufficient within the community, entirely absorbed, self-sufficient. We hope, of course, that there'll be a continuing friendship relationship, but we want them on their own and independent as soon as possible. A dependency does no one any good. Sponsorship is geared towards making the refugee independent.
The volunteer agency's first responsibility is to the refugee who, upon arrival, chose that agency to find a sponsor. Then the agency interviews the refugee in order to determine his abilities and needs. Here, Nan Borton of the International Rescue Committee interviews Win Tree Tu, who with her younger brother and infant son escaped during the evacuation. Mrs. Tu's husband, a Vietnamese Air Force officer, planned to follow, but so far she has been unable to locate him. She fears that they have been separated permanently and has realized that it is up to her to support her brother and infant son. After determining the refugee's abilities and needs, the volunteer agency then goes about matching the refugee with a potential sponsor. Most matching between sponsors and refugees is done by phone, but if possible, potential sponsors are encouraged to come to the refugee camp for a meeting before the final sponsorship agreement is made. Refugees, as well as sponsors, have the right of refusal, and some refugees are reluctant to leave the camp. At Indiantown Gap, however, the refugee no longer is permitted to turn down more than 2 sponsorship offers unless there is a medical or family reason.
We just very recently sent some Vietnamese into the camp, people who have been resettled but who are trained in social research, to do an attitudinal sample for us. And they came out extremely surprised that they ran into practically no cases of somebody who said, gee, this is just fine for me. But the overwhelming number of people at Fort Indiantown Gap had to have one basic question answered. When do I get out? And then the second one, who's my sponsor, and so on.
Most agencies are encouraging group sponsorships. The farm sponsorship by the St. Teresa's Parish in New Cumberland, Pennsylvania, appears to be working out well. The farm children seem to be adjusting, and they've discovered that kids need not speak the same language in order to have fun playing dolls and a new game called football. They live in a frame house owned by the church and adjacent to the parish house and the parochial school where the children have been enrolled. The family fled from Laos, where Joe worked for 17 years for the American Embassy as an administrative assistant. For the time being, he is working for the church, helping to maintain the grounds and buildings. His wife, Mary Ann, is learning to cook American style for the parish priests. In addition to the Pham family, other Vietnamese now are living in the New Cumberland area. Individuals in the St. Teresa's Parish have sponsored 2 additional families, and the school is used as a clearinghouse for donated clothing and furniture. The parishioners are enthusiastic about the sponsorship, and their welcome to the Phams has been warm. The question could be asked, why should we help? Why don't we help those Americans who have been living in need for decades and indeed even for centuries? There may be no answer but of the heart. We are largely a nation of immigrants. Perhaps our first service to ourselves is fulfilling an historical obligation, an obligation that is neither political nor philosophical nor moral. It is a human imperative. And who knows, perhaps we might find joy in helping to close the gap.